Yesterday, Virginia held a special election. No candidates, no party races, just one question on the ballot. And that single question may do more to shape the outcome of this fall's midterms than almost anything else happening right now. Here's the thing, though. Most people couldn't tell you what Virginians actually voted on. So let's break it down. What was on the ballot? Why it matters far beyond Virginia's borders, how both parties got pulled into a redistricting arms race, what the lawsuits argue, and why the courtrooms may actually matter more than the vote itself. My name is Sarah, and this is your vote on Ethos Trek. I apologize in advance if you hear a squealing in the background. I can hear it in my headphones, so I'm pretty sure you can hear it as well. It's springtime here in the Badger State, and I live next to a pond. What you hear is the Froggy Lonely Heart Chorus. They seem to have just as many opinions about the dating pool in this state as the humans. And the frogs get more vocal about it every year. What Virginians actually voted on. Virginia has 11 congressional seats. Right now, Democrats hold 6 of them. Republicans hold 5. Back in 2020, Virginia voters passed a constitutional amendment that handed map drawing power away from politicians and gave it to a bipartisan redistricting commission, half citizens, half legislators. Equal representation from both parties. The idea was to take politics out of line drawing. The maps drawn by that commission were set to stay in place until 2031. Yesterday's vote asked Virginians to temporarily undo that. Specifically, the ballot measure asked whether the state legislature, currently controlled by Democrats, should be allowed to bypass the commission, draw new congressional maps now, and use those maps for the 2026, 2028, and 2030 elections after the 2030 census. The bipartisan commission would come back. The map that Democrats had already drafted and passed, which would only take effect if voters said yes, is widely described as a Democratic gerrymander. Based on recent election results, it would favor Democrats in 10 of Virginia's 11 congressional districts, leaving Republicans with just one safe seat. Voters approved it, narrowly, by about 3 percentage points. To understand why this small margin referendum in one state became an $83 million campaign, you have to zoom out. Republicans currently hold a 3-seat majority in the U.S. House. That margin is thin enough that shifting just a handful of congressional seats could flip control. And that's exactly what's at stake. Virginia isn't an isolated case. It's one piece of a nationwide redistricting domino effect that started when President Trump publicly urged Republican-controlled states to redraw their congressional maps mid-decade, before the next census, to add seats favorable to the GOP. Texas led the way, enacting a new map in 2025, projected to swing as many as 5 congressional seats Republican. Missouri and North Carolina followed, each pushing out another Democratic seat. Democrats, holding fewer state trifectas than Republicans, had fewer places to respond. California was one of them. Voters there approved mid-decade redistricting last November, shifting 5 GOP-leaning districts leftward. Virginia was next, with Democrats holding the governorship, both chambers of the legislature, and a reliably blue electorate in Northern Virginia and Richmond. It became the party's best remaining opportunity to offset Republican gains. If the new Virginia map holds up, Democrats could net 4 additional House seats from this state alone. Combined with California, That's potentially 9 new Democratic seats from redistricting, nearly erasing the Republican gains from Texas, Missouri, and North Carolina. The House majority may literally be drawn on a map. Why are both parties escalating? You'll hear each side describe this as the other side's fault, and both sides are telling a version of the truth. Republicans point out that Virginia voters approved the bipartisan commission just 6 years ago, in 2020. Democrats are now asking voters to bypass that same system they once praised. Critics note that the very Democrats championing yesterday's vote were not long ago loudly opposing partisan redistricting. Republican leaders called it, quote, an egregious power grab, unquote. Democrats counter that they aren't starting this fight, they're responding to one. They argue that when Trump pushed Texas to redraw its map mid-decade without a court order requiring it, the old norms were already gone. Quote, Virginia voters chose to fight back against Trump's effort to rig congressional maps, unquote, said the campaign manager for the pro-redistricting group. Governor Spanberger framed it as a, quote, temporary measure, unquote, to, quote, restore fairness, unquote, before the 2030 census puts things back on track. What's clear is that both parties are now operating in a world where redistricting has become a continuous tactical weapon, not a once-a-decade line on a calendar. The escalation has a logic of its own. If one side does it, the other side can't afford not to. Here's where it gets complicated, because voters approving this measure may not be the end of the story. Before a single ballot was cast yesterday, Republicans had already filed 3 separate lawsuits in Virginia courts, all of which are still pending before the Virginia Supreme Court. The arguments go roughly like this. First, that Democrats violated procedure. Virginia's Constitution requires that proposed amendments be posted publicly at circuit clerk offices for at least 90 days before an election. Democrats fast-tracked the amendment through a special legislative session in October 2025, and opponents say that timeline didn't comply with the law. Second, that the special session was improperly expanded. Republicans argue that the House Speaker didn't have the authority to broaden the scope of that special session to include a constitutional amendment, and that the redistricting measure was therefore invalid from the start. Third, that the ballot language was misleading. The question voters saw asked whether the Constitution should be amended to, quote, restore fairness, unquote. The Republican National Committee argued in its lawsuit that those words were not just spin, they were an unconstitutional misrepresentation, because the measure actually removed the existing nonpartisan process rather than restoring anything. A lower court judge agreed with several of these arguments and blocked the referendum twice. Both times, the Virginia Supreme Court overruled him and allowed the vote to proceed. But crucially, the court did not rule on whether the process was actually legal. It said only that stopping voters from going to the polls wasn't the right way to resolve it. The court explicitly reserved judgment on the underlying legal questions. This is the part that most election coverage has underplayed. Oral arguments before this Virginia Supreme Court on these lawsuits are tentatively scheduled for April 27th, 6 days from now. Legal experts have described the current situation as, quote, uncharted territory, unquote. A voter-approved referendum could be overturned by the courts if the Supreme Court finds that the process was unconstitutional, that the amendment was improperly passed, or that the ballot language was misleading. The vote itself could be invalidated. The new maps would be thrown out. Virginia would revert to its current 6-5 map. One of the Republican plaintiffs in these cases, Congressman Morgan Griffith, said in a statement last night, quote, "I believe the Supreme Court of Virginia will overturn the underlying laws, thus invalidating the process," unquote. The new map technically goes into effect immediately, but if the court strikes it down before November's primaries, candidates already campaigning in the redrawn districts would have to scramble. Political analysts also note the time pressure. Early voting for primary elections is just weeks away. Even if the court sides with Republicans, it may face enormous practical pressure to move quickly, or face an argument that it's too late to undo what voters decided. So while yesterday's results are real, the map that comes out of this process may look very different depending on what 7 justices decide in the coming weeks. Here's the bottom line. Virginia just approved a major shift in its congressional maps, but by a narrow margin and under a legal cloud that hasn't cleared. The vote was the culmination of a months-long $83 million campaign, but it may also just be the halfway point. The redistricting fight in America isn't really about Virginia or Texas or California. It's about who controls the rules of the game. And right now, both parties have decided the rules are worth rewriting. Whether the courts agree is the next chapter. Sorry to rain on your parade. We'll keep tracking it. I'm Sarah. This is your vote on Ethos Trek.